Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix. In this episode, I'm going to discuss an aspect of knowledge that many people these days are not aware of, yet it has immense importance for our political freedom and our ability to argue for freedom. It can also leave us vulnerable to a serious logical fallacy, and it affects our ability to truly understand the ideas we claim to hold as true. I'm talking about the hierarchical structure of knowledge. When the natural hierarchy of knowledge is ignored, people believe in ideas that contradict the logical base of all human thinking and knowledge without seeing the logical fallacy that they have fallen for. This can leave minds in a mess of unidentified contradictions. But if we're truth seekers concerned for our political freedom, this just isn't good enough. We must be able to argue effectively for rights, which is the only means to political freedom. If you wish to be a spokesperson for freedom and to think efficiently and effectively and logically, you need to be familiar with the hierarchical structure of knowledge. Western culture is in deep trouble. Most people don't know what's going on, and those who begin to inquire have lost the thinking skills to evaluate ideas effectively. In disregard to the hierarchy of knowledge, people get suckered into believing great-sounding ideas such as, you can do anything, your thoughts create your own reality. But people don't see that this philosophical primacy of consciousness implicitly contradicts the concept of truth itself and destroys any chance of freedom. I covered this idea in some detail in episode 160 of the podcast, Dangerously False Ideas. It's also common to find that people cannot justify their conclusions. They cannot fully explain why they hold an idea to be true. And although this sounds like a different problem, it's rooted in the same failure to appreciate the hierarchical structure of knowledge, and thus the same failure to trace the ideas they hold back to their roots at the perceptual level. This problem in our thinking is not surprising. For many decades now, since Immanuel Kant, in fact, in the late 18th century, our leading intellectuals and philosophers have been declaring that reality is an unknowable illusion and that the mind is impotent. Yes, our leading intellectuals have for a long time been practicing serious intellectual dishonesty by disseminating these kinds of ideas that deliberately and knowingly to the intellectuals violate the hierarchy of knowledge. It's understandable if the ordinary man on the street doesn't know about the hierarchy of knowledge, but not philosophical leading intellectuals. Most people do not genuinely understand the big issues of today that affect our political freedom, such as the alleged climate emergency and the alleged pandemic. They simply hold a set of inconsistent and contradictory beliefs. A typical one being believing in freedom, being an advocate of freedom, and yet thinking that capitalism is evil and is the problem. To genuinely understand the conceptual ideas you consider to be true, you must be able to connect them back to reality, to make them fully real and give them their meaning. This is what it means to understand an idea. It has to be integrated without contradiction into the sum of one's existing knowledge and connected to the facts of reality in order to give it meaning. When this has happened, only then can the idea be explained to others. All knowledge fits into a contextual structure that starts with the observation of reality, observing the world around us and forming concepts of all the things that we perceive. This ultimately includes concepts of the existent things as well as attributes and actions and spatial as well as temporal relationships, concepts of all of these things. And only when we've grasped the most basic concepts of individual concretes can further concepts be formed by observing the similarities and differences between those already formed. All of our knowledge follows the same pattern as the initial formation of the basic concepts, and then using those to form still more complex concepts. It builds upon itself, one step at a time. We learn the foundational things first, and we build on these foundations. We can't begin by studying for a degree and finish up by learning the alphabet. We have to start at the beginning and build up to the increasingly complex. It sounds kind of obvious when you start to think about it, but it's amazing how easily this is missed in general thinking. The complexity is increased by forming concepts from earlier concepts and drawing both wider and narrower abstractions as more and more concepts are formed. In her book Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, Ayn Rand explains, "Observe that the concept furniture is an abstraction one step further removed from perceptual reality than any of its constituent concepts. Table is an abstraction, since it designates any table, but its meaning can be conveyed simply by pointing to one or two perceptual objects. There is no such perceptual object as furniture. There are only tables, chairs, beds, etc. The meaning of furniture cannot be grasped unless one has first grasped the meaning of its constituent concepts. These are its link to reality." Close quote. It can be helpful to think of the sum of your knowledge as a massive skyscraper. Such a building rests on firm foundations, and then every part of its structure is added on top of that in a logical sequence. The entrance lobby rests on the basement and foundations, and the top floors rest on the whole structure. In the same way, complex conceptual ideas are supported by simpler but logically antecedent conceptual ideas. Of course, some ideas are at an equivalent position in the hierarchy, like two different offices on the same floor of the skyscraper. But the important point to get here is the necessary vertical relationship between more complex concepts and the simpler ones from which they are formed. As a very straightforward example, consider that the idea of a bachelor necessarily rests on the idea of marriage. If there was no such conceptual idea as marriage, then the idea of being a bachelor, or a spinster for that matter, would have no meaning. It's the antecedent or the preceding concept of marriage that gives bachelorhood or spinsterhood its meaning. Again, from the Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, Rand continues, quote, "Starting from the base of conceptual development, from the concepts that identify perceptual concretes, the process of cognition moves in two interacting directions, toward more extensive and more intensive knowledge, toward wider integrations and more precise differentiations. Following the process, and in accordance with cognitive evidence, earlier formed concepts are integrated into wider ones or subdivided into narrower ones." Close quote. When we consider complex ideas containing multiple higher concepts, there are necessarily a great many previous, more fundamental concepts underneath, as it were, the ones being considered. These antecedent concepts are implicitly assumed, just like the lower floors of a tall building are assumed when you stand on one of the floors above. Consider these further examples. The concept of motion implies and necessitates the antecedent concept of entity, or the thing that moves. The concept of change implies the concept of identity and the concept of time. That identity then, this identity now. On a more day-to-day sort of level, when you go to your doctor to consult him on some illness, what is the theory of health and disease from which his thinking and his education stems? These ideas will necessarily inform his whole process of diagnosis and treatment. His conclusions about the nature of disease and its causation lie right at the base of his whole approach to medicine and will inform how he proceeds to try and help you. The hierarchy of knowledge has huge implications for all of us concerned with freedom, because concepts such as freedom and rights are quite high-level abstractions. The precise meanings of these concepts are not at all obvious. Their meaning has to be conceptually grasped by integrating many low-level conceptual ideas. Rights are a moral concept, defining and sanctioning the actions of individual men in a social context. To begin to trace this concept back to its roots in reality, we must first be aware of morality and the purpose it serves human life. A morality is a code of values or ethics to guide the choice and actions that shape an individual's life. Under this idea, this concept, we have further conceptual ideas, that of choice, of alternatives, of values, of consequences. In order to fully understand what rights are, it's quite a long conceptual path to trace our understanding back to the facts of reality. However, this is precisely what must be done by every freedom advocating activist in order to know exactly what they are talking about. Consider also that every system of politics implicitly rests on a system of morality or ethics. I must add here that I consider ethics and morality to be interchangeable terms. So, politics is the science that deals with how men should act with respect to one another in a social context. Morality, however, is the science of how the individual man should best act in support of his life or her life and its enjoyment. It is logical, therefore, that one should first decide how the individual should best act on his own or her own before approaching the question of how anyone should act in a social context. In other words, a proper code of morality must come first. Or to put it the other way around, when considering political ideas, it's very important to see that a particular political theory comes from a specific system of morality. And you might as well note, collectivism comes from altruism, very popular and widely held idea today. Freedom, on the other hand, comes from rational egoism. We live in a context where our political freedom is fast being lost. These days, we are having to take positive action to preserve what freedoms we have left. This involves being able to reason for freedom and argue for it with clear, logically presented ideas. It is therefore imperative that we fully understand that which we are arguing for. But most freedom fighters don't properly understand the concept, and therefore stand little chance of successfully achieving it. For example, if you haven't grasped that freedom is inherently selfish, and rightly so, because it stands on a morality of rational egoism, which means being left alone to act on one's own judgment, then you will continue to argue against the proper system of ethics that can only lead to freedom, namely rational egoism, and you'll be left inclined to consider selfishness as evil and to argue for altruism, inadvertently supporting a collectivist politics. Freedom fighters need to be fully aware of the hierarchical structure of knowledge so that they can relate these higher level concepts all the way back to the facts of reality, understand them fully, and therefore be able to argue for them effectively. Our concepts are our units of thinking. They're the pieces that we move around in our mind, each one an idea in itself. And if we are unaware of the hierarchical structure of knowledge, the higher, more abstract concepts we use, such as prosperity, wealth, democracy, individualism, these become like floating balloons or floating abstractions in our minds. They are disconnected from any meaning from the antecedent concepts that could provide the context to give them precise meaning. Definitions are important because if the units of our thinking are loose and ill-defined, the efficiency with which we arrive at our conclusions is necessarily compromised. But if the hierarchical structure of knowledge is not respected, and if we do not know how each of these concepts that we use reduces back to reality, then our concepts are completely emptied of meaning. There's no way that we can have an accurate definition. They become disconnected from the conceptual context that alone can give them the meaning. As we grow and learn, moving from infancy through childhood and hopefully eventually to functional adulthood, we are constantly updating our mental map of reality. Our minds should properly be seeking to integrate all the information we hear into one consistent and non-contradictory reflection of the world out there. Our knowledge is like a vast 3D mental map of the terrain, and the terrain is the world we live in. Our mental map of reality, of the world that we live in, has to contain both the horizontal and vertical integrations of all of the ideas we hold, all these conceptual ideas, forming a vast and complex hierarchical structure. Awareness of this process helps to keep our knowledge grounded in reality and supports genuine understanding. When we ignore or fail to grasp the hierarchical structure of knowledge, we can literally get our thinking upside down. We can find ourselves unwittingly treating a relatively high-level concept as a fundamental or a starting point for a particular line of reasoning. And from there, some people end up arguing against a more fundamental concept that's actually already being implicitly used within their argument. An example of this is when people tell you that you can't prove that existence is real, and they suggest that it's all an illusion. In this example, the concepts of proof and of illusions are both higher level concepts that rest on the axiom that existence exists, i.e. that it's real. So this is a classic case of standing on a higher level concept and arguing against the foundations beneath. Another example is when people claim that consciousness creates reality, as we mentioned at the beginning, the primacy of consciousness. In this case, the objective nature of reality is denied by implication, and yet acceptance of the objective nature of reality is the only possible basis of all knowledge. The law of identity states that things are what they are. A is A, irrespective of anyone's thoughts, feelings, wishes, whims or fears. It's independent of consciousness. Reality is an objective absolute. The law of identity is axiomatic and right at the base of thinking. You have to use it even in the process of arguing against it. So this leads us on to the fallacy of the stolen concept. And those, in fact, are examples of it. Ayn Rand was the first philosopher to identify the hierarchy of knowledge and also the resulting logical fallacy that she called the fallacy of the stolen concept. This fallacy consists of using a concept while denying or ignoring the logically antecedent concepts upon which the concept one is using depends. So the concept is being used without any epistemological right to it, and hence the term stolen concept. Returning to the metaphor of knowledge as a very tall skyscraper can help to illustrate the absurdity of this fallacy. Imagine standing on the top floor of such a building whilst arguing against the existence of the floors beneath it. When we argue using high-level concepts, we are necessarily standing intellectually on all of the concepts beneath and ultimately on the law of identity at the foundations. This is what we need to be aware of. Let's look at some more examples of the stolen concept. Consider the well-known anecdote, "All property is theft," coined by a French anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in his 1840 book, What is Property? This phrase is nonsense because the concept of theft is necessarily derived from the antecedent concept of property. If there was no such concept as rightfully owned property, there could not be any concept of theft. Again, the word theft would be an empty sound that meant nothing. The phrase, "all property is theft," is meaningless. It's a typical example of this upside-down thinking. Some people today ask the question, how do you know there is an external world? Meaning, how do you know that anything exists except consciousness? And here, the stolen concept is knowledge. You can't speak of knowledge while denying existence and consciousness. The axioms of existence and consciousness are the philosophical bedrock on which the concept of knowledge stands. Without existence, what could there possibly be knowledge of? In the question, how do you know that reality isn't an hallucination? The concept of hallucination is the stolen concept. An hallucination can only be defined in contradistinction to normal perception of reality. So if you are questioning reality, you have no epistemological right to speak of hallucinations. You are again arguing against that which you are intellectually standing on. In the questions, how do you know that you are conscious, or how do you know you exist? The stolen concept is once again knowledge. The axioms of existence and consciousness are the philosophical bedrock on which the concept of knowledge stands. And if you haven't yet established your own existence, you are in no place to be discussing the concept of knowledge. The concept of knowledge can only have meaning in the context of existence, something to know, and of course of consciousness, someone to know it. The Latin cognito ergo sum, usually translated into English as I think therefore I am, is the first principle of René Descartes' philosophy that was originally published in French as Je pense donc je suis in his 1637 Discourse on Method. This phrase is yet another example of illogical nonsense because thinking is a very high level and sophisticated concept. Thinking refers to the specific mental activity of reasoning purposefully towards some goal. It's a form of mental activity distinguishable from others, such as remembering, worrying, or imagining. It's not logical to be holding one's existence in doubt while using such a high-level concept which assumes a vast number of antecedent concepts, all of which rest on the law of identity and the axioms of existence and consciousness. All of the claims you may hear that consciousness creates reality, or postulating that everything is an illusion, or is a hallucination, or is imagined into existence, all of these ideas that implicitly undermine the objective nature of reality are logical fallacies based on the denial of the hierarchical structure of knowledge. They all implicitly deny the objective nature of reality and therefore undermine the concept of truth. This is why the hierarchical structure of truth must be known about and respected if we wish to know what is true. We cannot allow sophists and propagandists to spread these ideas that undermine our cause at the very foundations. It cannot be overstated how important it is for all truth seekers and anyone who cares about political freedom to clearly grasp that these ideas implicitly undermine truth, freedom, and even rational discourse. Great care must be taken to make sure that the thinker stands on firm epistemological ground, that of the law of identity, and make explicit the fact that reality is an objective absolute. In order to reinforce our understanding of how important it is to appreciate the hierarchical structure of knowledge, and to make sure that we don't fall into the mental habit of the fallacy of the stolen concept, we must look very briefly at how the mind works. This is because there's a widely held belief that undermines the concept of knowledge being stored according to a logical hierarchy. Now, this belief is that the mind works by association, meaning that ideas are stored solely based on being associated with other ideas. Now, it is true that the mind does work by association to some extent, inasmuch as it defaults to this mechanism in the absence of a logical connection. But the default is far from being the proper method, since it cannot foster understanding. We've all had the experience of a particular memory being triggered by a specific situation or a piece of music or an image or even a fragrance. But this is not the complete picture of how our human form of consciousness is best operated. Association, as I said, does play a part in our thinking, and it can be used effectively to brainstorm ideas for creative purposes. This is because logically related ideas are necessarily associated with each other, but the converse is not necessarily true. Associated ideas may or may not be logically related. For example, ice cream sales correlating with shark attacks is an association by virtue of both happening in summer months, but the connection is not logical. Logical connection is stronger than association because it affords understanding. Items on a list are associated by virtue of the fact that they're on the list, but remembering the list will be much harder than to remember a series of logically connected items or events. So the takeaway point here is that Logically connected ideas are necessarily associated, but associated ideas are not necessarily logically connected. If all the ideas you hold are logically linked down to the self-evident perceptual base in reality, and they are linked to one another as well by horizontal and vertical integration, then they will necessarily be associated. And when I say horizontal and vertical integrations, I mean joining the dots in your mind by looking for and seeing these connections. And this requires conscious effort and a deliberate choice to think. These integrations and connections won't happen automatically. But the benefit of initiating this mental process is not only achieving clear understanding, but also that the presence of any potential contradiction can be seen, which can then serve to flag an error in one's reasoning. The contradiction signalling that an idea doesn't fit and that something needs to be checked out or investigated. So, associative thinking alone doesn't give you the solid understanding that a logically connected thinking gives you. It doesn't enable you to connect ideas back to reality, but only to associate them with other ideas, which themselves may not be clearly understood. And if you're focusing on a number of ideas that are associated with each other, they could all be false, and the contradictions to other facts of reality may not be noticed without these horizontal and vertical integrations, the connecting of ideas, joining of dots. Associative thinking, therefore, is a method that kind of gets you only halfway there. The danger of believing that associative thinking is how the mind works sidesteps the proper method of proactively looking for logical connections, which is the only way to ensure that your conclusions are true. Ultimately, all the ideas you hold must be connected to reality. If in your mind they are not, then understanding hasn't been achieved, and you simply hold some chosen beliefs. Something I learned from the objectivist writer Craig Biddle is that when we say that something makes sense, it means that the idea in question makes it to the senses. It means that the idea can be traced back to the facts of reality and thus related to the world. Yeah, that makes sense. Is a kind of aha moment when the last conceptual penny drops. It means that the idea being considered has been logically integrated. It's now connected to the rest of our understanding of reality. It makes sense. It fits logically with all the other ideas that you consider to be true. So, by way of conclusion, the current state of human thinking in general is abysmal, probably due to many decades of education that ignores and violates the hierarchy of knowledge and a host of other factors. Many people cannot spot logical fallacies at all, let alone the more sophisticated ones, such as the fallacy of the stolen concept. But the root of all clear and efficient thinking is grasping that it all rests on the self-evident and the law of identity. It is difficult to conclude that current Western civilization will avoid the impending collectivist tyranny, while so few people can think effectively and therefore be in a position to defend the concept of rights, the only means to political freedom. Unsurprisingly, at least a part of the solution lies in recognizing and respecting the hierarchical structure of knowledge. This means developing an awareness of which ideas are primaries, lower level concepts nearer to the perceptual level, and which are derived, the higher level complex concepts. Very important to know which is which. It's important to bear in mind that the concept of proof is a form of validation, using inference from other previous knowledge. The self-evident is a more basic form of validation and is what the concept of proof ultimately rests on. And this means that to demand proof of something that is self-evident is a contradiction and an example, once again, of upside-down thinking. I recommend that if you're a keen truth seeker and if you're passionate about freedom, I seriously recommend that you become familiar with the law of identity and the axioms of existence, consciousness, and identity. Because when we grasp that these are the irreducible base of all human knowledge and that all of our concepts rest on these, it's much easier to spot the many examples of the stolen concept. And we hear a lot of these in philosophical ideas that ultimately destroy the concept of truth, as I mentioned. So the best thing that we can do to ensure peace and freedom is to sharpen our own minds and to take up the challenge of being one of the new citizen intellectuals that are so desperately needed these days. And to do this, of course, we must learn to think efficiently. So thank you for listening. I hope you've got some value from this. I've got a bunch of links on the podcast page where the show notes are that you might find helpful. Some of the sources that I've used and also links to some other podcasts that I've done in the past that are related and you might find similarly useful. But if you did enjoy this, please give us a like and do feel free to drop a comment or ask a question. I'm very keen to discuss any of these ideas. But do check out the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's loads more on there on thinking, discerning truth, and indeed loads of very useful information on health, things that we need to know. So once again, thank you for listening, and do join me once again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be